All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Heather Stenson. I am here to tell you to make some friends, and specifically, you should make some friends of the docs. So, big warning, first off, you're about to see a lot of emojis. So at Mapbox, we are emoji fanatics. This is a small sampling of our custom Slack emoji set. I am just going to use the standard emojis that we all know and hopefully are not too annoyed by. So consider yourselves warned. So we already kind of covered this a little bit, but I'm going to ask again for a show of hands, just so we can orient ourselves a little bit. Who here considers their primary job to be documentation? Yeah, okay, so that's a lot of people, which is more or less what we would expect. The conference is called Write the Docs, but that's not everybody. So those folks who already raised their hands who are not documentarians, please raise your hands again. Yeah, okay, so not as many people, but here they are. And they're, again, at a conference called Write the Docs. And that's not even their job. They're not documentarians. But I have a hunch about these non-documentarians. I think I know who they are. They're friends of the docs. Friend of the docs. It's a pretty evocative term, right? I bet a lot of you already have an idea in your head of who a friend of the docs is and what they do. So I know that the first time I heard the term, I was delighted and intrigued. So a little backstory on that. I work at Mapbox. I've been there a little over a year. And Mapbox provides mapping and geodata services that other companies can build tools on top of. So obviously there's a need for a lot of very technical, developer-focused documentation. So when I was in the early stages of the interview process, I was looking through their docs, which I think is what a lot of us do. If you're thinking about joining a company to write documentation for them, you sit down and then look at the docs to see what shape things are in. So as I was looking through the Mapbox docs, I was impressed. There was a lot of documentation, for one thing. There were a lot of different well-defined content types. They were aimed at users with different experience levels. And it was all really well thought out, really well designed. So I was impressed. And I'm going into the interview process thinking, there's a whole team of people working on this. So imagine my surprise when I get there and I learn that there's only one technical writer at Mapbox. And what's more, she'd only been a technical writer there for slightly less than a year. Before that, she'd been working as a support engineer. So how is it possible that there was so much great documentation? Yeah, which it's accurate. But so there was so much great documentation, but there was only one person working on it. And so during my interview with Colleen, who was the sole technical writer at the time and is now the manager of our small but mighty team of 3, I asked her this. And it turns out that she had an amazing trick up her sleeve. She told me that other people on other teams were helping her with documentation voluntarily. They were opening tickets with thoughtful suggestions about ways to make the docs better. Often they'd follow up by doing actual work, whether by editing existing docs or writing new ones. They were pitching in on front-end work to make the documentation easier to navigate. They were chiming in when Colleen asked for advice and opinions. Basically, what she was telling me, she was saying that there was a big group of people who were helping her with writing, editing, fact-checking, and just generally championing documentation at Mapbox, even though they weren't part of the documentation team. And Colleen called this group of enthusiastic helpers the Friends of the Docs. So obviously my mind was blown. This sounded downright dreamy. At other places I'd worked as a technical writer, there was a stark divide between documentation and everything else. And of course, there was the suspicion that everything else was far, far more important because it was so hard to get any help with the documentation. And I think we've all had these experiences. You send out your meeting invite to your subject matter expert, and they get mysteriously declined. You ask follow-up questions, and they just sort of disappear. and you ask for feedback, and you get no feedback until the very last second. And I'm not saying these things don't happen at Mapbox, because they do, but they happen far less frequently than at other. Seem to be losing. How are we doing?
We always have a backup plan.
Okay. We're good? Okay. Can we hear? All right. Hooray! We can hear. All right, cool. All right. So, backtrack slightly. So, I'm not saying that these things never happen at Mapbox. They do. But they happen far less frequently than at other places I've worked. And I think that's attributable to the Friends of the Docs culture at Mapbox. So it's just a given. There are always more docs to write than there are people to write them. For context, at Mapbox there are 3 of us, but there are over 800 pieces of individual documentation on our website. And we're launching new products that need new documentation all the time. And I'm willing to bet that your company's situation is similar, no matter what size your documentation team is or what size your company is. But if you have Friends of the Docs, you're able to get more done than you would otherwise. You can move farther faster. So let's dive in. What makes somebody a Friend of the Docs? A Friend of the Docs is somebody at your company who meets 2 requirements. 1, they're enthusiastic about documentation. And 2, they help out with the documentation in some way. You need both of these things to be true in order to consider someone a Friend of the Docs. So we have this very scientific chart here. Somebody who's enthusiastic about documentation but doesn't help out, that's nice, but they're a docs enthusiast. They're not a Friends of the Docs. And somebody who helps out but isn't enthusiastic, it's nice to have the help, but this person is a subject matter expert. They're not a Friend of the Docs. Which brings me to a quick sidebar to discuss the difference between a subject matter expert and a Friend of the Docs. There is overlap, because a subject matter expert is the person who knows the things that you need to know in order to write the documentation that you need to write, and often a Friend of the Docs is going to play that same role. But the difference is in the level of involvement and enthusiasm. You might have to hunt a subject matter expert down, and it can be rough to get the information that you need out of them, because again, they've got other stuff going on, everything else more important than documentation. But this isn't going to be the case with a Friend of the Docs. A Friend of the Docs is going to help you out voluntarily, and they're going to be happy to do it. So how does a Friend of the Docs help with documentation? The list of documentation-related tasks that they can help with includes, but is not limited to, flagging documentation-related issues, suggesting improvements to existing documentation, proposing new documentation, editing and fact-checking documentation that you're writing. They can be advocates for documentation and the documentation team at your company. And finally, Holy Grail, they can write documentation themselves. Basically, Friends of the Docs can help a documentation team of any size cover more ground. And having Friends of the Docs has worked out so well for us at Mapbox that we think everybody needs them. So let's just say you're convinced. You need Friends of the Docs. But having Friends of the Docs isn't a matter of luck in most cases. Instead, you have to carefully cultivate a Friend of the Docs community. When it comes to documentation, people in your company are going to fall somewhere on this spectrum. First up, we've got Docs Oblivious. This person might not even know that your company has documentation, much less a documentation team. Then we've got Docs Aware. This person knows that your company has documentation. They don't think about it very much. They probably don't care about it, but at least they know it exists. And then we've got Docs Enthusiast. We've already mentioned these folks. They know about the docs, and they like the docs. They're almost there, but they just haven't made the leap to helping out with documentation yet. Finally, we've got the Friends of the Docs. These are the pinnacle. A Friend of the Docs is enthusiastic about documentation, and they want to help you with it. So your goal is to get people who are at oblivious, aware, or enthusiastic to friend of the docs. And there are a few different strategies you can take. So the first strategy is look in likely places. Now, friends of the docs can be found in surprising places in your company, but there are a few teams and a few roles where they're pretty reliably found. First of those is the support team. People in support have a direct line of communication with your customers, which means that they're some of the first people to notice if documentation is missing or incorrect. And they've got a vested interest in making it easy for customers to help themselves, which nearly always involves documentation. A likely role is product managers. PMs are really in touch with the products they're working on, and they really, really want customers to be able to understand and use those products. Luckily for us, PMs are aware that one of the best ways to achieve these is often through good documentation. So they're great people to have on their side, and bonus, they can be instrumental in converting other people into friends of the docs as well. On product teams, individual contributors can be a good source of friends of the docs. That's because they know the product really well. After all, they're building it. They can be the source of truth on how to actually use the product. They don't fall prey to, marketing, mumbo jumbo, and all of that. They actually know how to use the thing. And they really want customers to be able to understand and use the product. So when you find an individual contributor who can be a friend of the docs, you hold on tight because this person is gold. Now, strategy 2, it's kind of related, but it's a little bit different. Make allies at the top. Now, when I say the top, I don't necessarily mean your CEO, although that'd be really cool. I'm thinking more about team leads. This is somebody who's close to the work that's being done, but is still able to influence people on their team. So how do you turn a team lead into a friend of the docs? And the answer to that is get FaceTime with them. If you can wrangle it, get in the same room with them on a consistent basis. At Mapbox, we aim for quarterly meetings with these folks. And so you can use this time to check in about projects that are coming up that they're going to need documentation for. This step is huge because it automatically makes them look at their upcoming work through the lens of documentation. So documentation is on their mind, and they're going to start evaluating how it's going to fit into their upcoming work. But this isn't just one-sided. You can be communicating your needs as well during these meetings. It's a great time to start setting expectations about timetables and talking about who on their team is going to help you write the docs. Full disclosure, this strategy can be a long-term one. At Mapbox, we found that it does take most team leads a few rounds of meetings before they're fully on our side and invested. But once we get them as friends of the docs, they're typically friends of the docs for life. And the third strategy is share customer feedback about documentation. So I think it's fair to say that nobody works well in a feedback vacuum. We want to hear what we've done well so that we can do more of it, and we want to hear about what didn't go so great so that we can do better in the future. And this is something that you can leverage when you're making friends of the docs. So if you've gotten great feedback about a doc, that's something you should share. And you should share it with the people who helped out with the original documentation, because that's a great way to reinforce the fact that helping out with something can feel really good and be rewarding. But you can also share it with people who can use this good documentation and the good feedback as inspiration. You could go to somebody and say something like, this piece of documentation is landing really well with users. I want to do something similar to document this new product that you're working on, but I need your help. And then if you've gotten less than glowing feedback, that's valuable to share too. Even though it's not as immediately fun or uplifting, it's still a valuable strategy for making friends of the docs. Just as an example, at Mapbox, we had a potential customer who was having trouble following a particular guide. And they reached out to their sales enablement rep, who then reached out to us, because in their mind, it was a documentation issue. So based on that feedback, we were able to sit down with the product team in question and figure out how do we improve this guide so that the customer can follow it. And so now both the sales enablement team and the product team know that they can come to us with documentation-related issues, And also we have a few new friends of the docs. And the fourth strategy, business, business, business. Tie documentation to your company's bottom line. For us as documentarians, the connection between good documentation and happy customers is really clear. But some people in your company might need this connection to be laid out in black and white. Obviously, again to us, missing or incomplete documentation can negatively impact customer experience. Your company can literally lose money because of it. So I mentioned just a second ago that we'd gotten negative feedback about a customer, about a guide that they were having trouble with. And what I didn't say is if they didn't get the product working, they weren't going to sign a contract with us. So that was money on the table, like something we could literally attach a dollar value to. And that's super convincing. Strategy 5, time-tested, straightforward. It's bribery. Never underestimate the power of a sticker that only you can hand out. I'm just saying, people will do a lot of things for that, like a special sticker, oh man. Or a t-shirt that somebody can only get by participating in, a documentation sprint. Think about pizza parties to thank people who contributed to a newly launched guide. And of course, a documentation happy hour can be a great way to make new friends. So depending on who you're trying to convert to a friend of the docs and where they fall on the docs awareness spectrum, you're going to use different combinations of these strategies. Somebody who's already a docs enthusiast probably doesn't need much to get them over the line. Give them a sticker if they help you stress test a new tutorial. They're your friend for life. With somebody who's docs aware, it's a little more work. But follow the strategies. Get regular meetings with them, share customer feedback, make the case for how documentation is going to help the company's bottom line. You're playing the long game, but you're in it to win. Now, docs oblivious people, they're tough to break through to, but it's not impossible. Just keep doing your good work, treat them like potential friends of the docs, and hopefully they're gonna come around. All right, so say you found some coworkers who are or could become friends of the docs. And the first thing you need to do is really think about how you stay in touch with them. A theme that's going to show up a few more times is that your relationship with a friend of the docs is a relationship. And like any relationship, communication is key. So how do you keep the lines of communication open? Easiest way is just build on top of what your company already has in place. So your company probably already has a way of tracking issues, and there's already a company-wide way of keeping in touch with each other. So this is going to look different from company to company. At Mapbox, we use GitHub for issue tracking and Slack for communication. So whatever it looks like at your company, you already have these channels. You just need a way of leveraging them. So I'd say create a documentation-specific communication channel that's open to your entire company, and create a documentation-specific issue tracker that's also open to the entire company. And that way, anybody who's interested can come into the communication channel and talk docs, or go into your issue tracker and open an issue. These specific channels create a way for people to communicate with you and with each other about documentation-related issues. At Mapbox, we've also created a special friend of the docs Slack handle. So if somebody self-identifies as a friend of the docs, we just add them to the handle. Then if we have a special documentation-related announcement or call to action, we can message the entire group easily. One caveat, don't give people too many ways to get in touch with you because they're going to get overwhelmed and possibly not use any of them. So stick with one communication channel, one issue tracker, then use them. So as you make friends with the docs, you are going to run into some obstacles, but you can beat them. Here are some of the most common. Obstacle 1, silos. Your company has a culture of working in silos. Big companies do have a reputation for this. Sometimes it's fair, sometimes it's not, but the reality is it can happen in companies of any size. And if there's a silo at your company, it's just accepted that docs team works on docs and nobody else works on docs. So how do you break this pattern? The most effective way that you can do this is by opening up your own docs silo. Invite people to look at what you're doing. The communication methods that we just talked about can be a great step towards this. You can also do text scrums, stand-ups, project boards, stuff like that. Ask for help and opinions, and people are going to becoming more comfortable with the idea that they can contribute to the docs, even if they're not on the docs team. Another way to break this pattern is to become a bridge between silos at your company. Often as a documentarian, you have a unique perspective because you can see what's happening in multiple teams in the company, while somebody who's working on a team is probably laser focused on what they're working on. You can bridge that gap with documentation. So whether you're opening up your own silo or being a bridge between silos, or hopefully both, your openness is going to encourage other people at your company to be open so that the idea of working across teams in general, and with the documentation team specifically, doesn't seem so foreign. Second obstacle, widespread docs obliviousness. So if documentation is an afterthought at your company, finding people who value docs enough to want to help with them is an uphill battle. And the best way to break through in this is to have the documentation team be very vocal and very visible. So publicize your wins. Shout it from the rooftops when you're launching a new piece of documentation. Reach out proactively to people who can share new documentation. Say your marketing team, sales team, support team. Let them know what you're working on. Everything that you do should say, we are a company that values documentation. And after a while, other people are going to start saying it too. Their actions are going to start reflecting it, and you're going to start turning these docs-oblivious people into friends of the docs. Obstacle 3, everybody is too dang busy. And this is hard to argue with because people do get really busy. But you have an amazing counter-argument because you can make an excellent case for spending a little time now to save a lot of time later. Just as an example, say that your support team is constantly having to guide users through a confusing process. If support team members can help you write a great tutorial right now, then that's something they can send to customers later. Or better yet, customers are going to find it on their own. They never write into support in the first place. Clearly, this message has broken through at Mapbox. In this screenshot, you can see a friend of the docs on our support team articulating the point pretty clearly. He says, how much time will this save me in user questions? And if the answer is that I will save more future hours than the time it takes to review, then the request is reasonable. I think he said 1 million hours, which maybe is a little exaggeration, but not too much. So, clearly is broken through. Obstacle 4, I've asked for help, but nobody's responding. This is rough. You've been vocal, you've been visible, you've let people see what you're working on, but when you ask for help, it's crickets. This is demoralizing, and it makes it hard to make friends of the docs. So if this is happening to you, one way to overcome it is to make your requests super targeted, both in terms of what you're asking and who you're asking it to. So instead of asking an entire team to review a documentation draft, ask 1 or 2 specific people on the team to review a specific section of the draft. That way you're making it personal to those people, and they're more likely to respond. This is also a great chance to start feeling out potential friends of the docs. Does somebody respond every time you ask? Does somebody never respond? That's a good indicator. So the nice thing about all of these strategies is they create a dopamine feedback loop that turns potential friends of the docs into full-fledged ones. Person helps with the docs, they see great customer and coworker response, they feel the satisfaction of a job well done, they want to help more. So even though the Friends of the Docs community was already thriving when I got there, I've learned that keeping it happy is an ongoing process. There are certain rules you do need to follow, things you need to do, things you need to avoid doing. Do model the behaviors that you'd like to see in your Friends of the Docs. If somebody verbally brings you feedback, show them how to open an official issue. Or if you've chatted with somebody about something that should be open to wider discussion, share it in your communication channel. If somebody asks you for help, be responsive. If somebody asks you for help, follow up in a timely manner. Basically, if there's something that you wish a friend of the docs was doing, you should be doing it too. Do loosen your grip just a little. I think a lot of documentarians, including me, we get kind of protective of the docs. We like being in control. But having Friends of the Docs means the documentation-related tasks, wow, I got tangled in that one. Having Friends of the Docs help you with documentation-related tasks means that you're not going to have control over every single sentence, which is fine. What you lose in control, you gain in extra productivity. Just take some deep breaths, give your Friends of the Docs room to work. Do set boundaries and parameters. Now, I know that these words have less than fun connotations, but they make it easier for people to help with documentation, and they make your job easier too. Think about ways to create parameters using your style guide, content types, and issue templates. At Mapbox, we have a system of automated tests that documentation has to pass before it can be published. They check for style guide compliance, spelling, passive voice, and more. So if somebody's writing a new doc or updating an existing one, we can be sure that these tests have to pass before anything can be published. So that makes it easier for these people to write something that we are happy to publish. And boundaries are like guardrails that keep people safe. We also have an automated system that makes it so a documentation team member has to sign off on a piece of documentation before it can be published. This makes us avoid situations in which somebody accidentally hits publish and puts something live before we're ready. So boundaries and parameters are part of any healthy relationship, including your relationship with the Friends of the Docs. Do help your Friends of the Docs in every way that you can. No matter how a Friend of the Docs is assisting you, do your best to make the process as easy as possible. Make connections between people or teams where connections need to be made. Project manage so that your Friend of the Docs doesn't have to. Adopt a task if your Friend of the Docs has to bow out, or find somebody else to adopt it. You can even make the decision to shelve a project if necessary, even if it's temporarily. Your goal is to help your Friends of the Docs feel like they're never being taken advantage of. After all, they're helping you out, and you want to foster good feelings so that they want to help you out again. Do keep the relationship fun and friendly. After all, friend is in the name. Think about ways to show the Friends of the Docs that you appreciate them. Again, there's always swag. Appreciation events are really good. Another great thing is public shout-outs. People like to be recognized for their contributions. Make an announcement in your public documentation channel thanking a Friend of the Docs for their help, and watch the good vibes flow. Be polite. This should go without saying, but always say please and thank you. And never, ever take a Friend of the Docs for granted. Do stay friends when things change. If your team grows or shrinks, this is going to change your relationship with your Friends of the Docs. If you're on a team that gets bigger, that's great, but it is going to change how you interact with your Friends of the Docs, because you're going to be able to take on more of the tasks that they were helping you out with. So this doesn't mean your friends aren't important anymore, but their role may change. And sometimes the documentation team gets smaller, even if it's temporarily. If your team shrinks for any reason, most Friends of the Docs are happy to help fill in the gap, which is great. So you might have noticed that I said this was a list of do's and don'ts, but there were only do's. And that's because you already know what the don'ts are. Again, they're the don'ts you should avoid in any relationship, not just the one with your Friends of the Docs. So don't be a jerk, don't take the other person for granted, and don't take advantage of the other person. Be a good friend, and your Friend of the Docs will be good to you. So as you've listened to this talk, you've probably identified some folks at your company who you'd consider to be a Friend of the Docs. You just didn't know to call them that. And you've probably thought about an even larger group of people who are Docs aware or Docs enthusiasts who can be converted. This tiny cactus believes in you, knows that you can do it. So one last thing, I'm going to follow my own advice and give a big public shout out. Thank you to Colleen and Katie, the amazing doc queens at Mapbox. Y'all are awesome. And of course, I want to thank our wonderful Friend of the Docs community. We literally couldn't do what we do without you, and we appreciate you so much. All right, thanks everyone.